Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to many of you who have come since yesterday, and welcome to those of you who are here for the first time today. We have two quite wonderful and important talks this morning. I will mention only that the second of these talks by Professor Leah Feldman of the University of Chicago will be by Zoom, but in this room. So we'll take advantage of the technology here. That will be at 11 o'clock. We begin, though, happily, with a talk by our good friend and ally, Bruce Robbins, who is the Old Dominion Foundation Professor in the Humanities at Columbia, and was the author of innumerable important books, some of which I have had the opportunity to talk about in print, and while Bruce has had the opportunity to talk about some of mine in print, which just indicates to you some of the personal connections that Bruce and I have had, along with all the other members of the collective, in these past 30-some years. I'm not going to say a great deal. Most of you know Bruce and know Bruce's work and know it well. You know his important studies of cosmopolitanism. You know his deep engagement with questions of the world system. You know of even more his engagement with questions of class. You know his commitment to a general critical politics of sociocultural placement and analysis. So I will stop there, introduce Bruce to you again, give him this podium, and tell you that he maintains his printed title, that is, There Is No Why. Please welcome Bruce Robbins.
This is a little bit too long, and I haven't written the introduction to the book that it's part of yet. So I'll be especially grateful for large framing questions that I won't be able to answer, but I'll be grateful for them anyway. Okay. Shortly before he died, he said to me, "You know, you never wrote a story with a villain in it." Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, in which this sentence appears, is another story without a villain in it. And the lack of a villain is striking, given that Vonnegut's most famous novel is famous above all for the exposure it gave to an under-acknowledged atrocity, the Allied firebombing of Dresden in early 1945, which, as you probably know, Vonnegut survived as a prisoner of war. So, should atrocity stories do without villains? Vonnegut says he acquired his suspicion of the villain when he briefly studied anthropology at the University of Chicago. Looking back on his instructors, he expresses something less than wholehearted approbation. Another thing they taught was that nobody was ridiculous or bad or disgusting. Vonnegut's account of post-war Chicago anthropology is remarkably consonant, however, with the post-human philosophy his protagonist encounters during a visit to the planet Tralfamadore, a possible stand-in for the University of Chicago, and later becomes an embarrassingly noisy proponent of. This cosmic cosmopolitanism declares Earthlings to be naively provincial, not just because of their eagerness to find someone to blame, but because they think in terms of causal explanation at all. In response to Billy Pilgrim's question, "Why me?" Why has he been kidnapped from Earth and installed as an edifying spectacle in a Tralfamadorian zoo? His captor answers, "There is no why." It's hard to know how Vonnegut means his readers to take all the Tralfamadorian shenanigans. The Tralfamadorians say there are no causes. With "There is no why," however, Vonnegut puts away his sci-fi toys and stakes a claim to high moral seriousness. He's borrowing almost word for word a line from Primo Levi's Holocaust memoir, If This Is a Man, Survival in Auschwitz. The reference, heavy with Holocaust gravitas, is to a scene from ordinary life for that small minority of arrivals at Auschwitz who are not immediately sent to the gas chambers, but instead are put to work and slated to be killed off more slowly. Levi, you probably know this, but I'll repeat it. Levi is always thirsty, like his fellow inmates, whose only hydration comes in the form of salty soup. One day, in search of relief, he reaches through the barracks window and snaps off an icicle. Before he can lick the icicle, however, it is batted out of his hand by a passing guard. Levi asks the guard in German, warum? And the guard replies, hier ist kein warum, there is no why here. As Vonnegut's borrowing suggests, the formula there is no why has broken free of here, taken over, for instance, by Claude Lanzmann, director of the Holocaust documentary Shoah. It's offered as a universal guide for dealing with a world defined, that's the implication, by the fact that it allowed Auschwitz to happen. His film refuses to enter into explanations of the Holocaust, Lanzmann declares, because there is, quote, an absolute obscenity in the project of understanding. And yet, as the intellectual historian Dominic Lacapra has pointed out, in If This Is a Man, the person who says there is no why here is not Primo Levi himself, it's an SS guard. So those who draw a sacred circle around the atrocity demanding a reverential unintelligibility are agreeing with the Nazi. They're not making common cause with Levi. Levi rarely personifies Nazism, but he gives his readers at least one Nazi who might count as a villain. And it's in recollecting the physical presence of this Nazi that Levi comes closest to the goal of understanding, I don't apologize for the word, Auschwitz. One day he's called in to be examined on his knowledge of chemistry. The examiner is one Dr. Panwitz. Panwitz looks at him with eerily empty eyes. Levi writes, that look was not one between two men. And if I had known how completely to explain the nature of that look, which came as if across the glass window of an aquarium between two beings who live in different worlds, I would also have explained the essence of the great insanity of the Third Germany. Levi goes on to ventriloquize Panwitz in this way. This something in front of me belongs to a species which it is obviously opportune to suppress. In this particular case, one has to first make sure that it does not contain some utilizable element. As it happens, Panwitz decides that Levi does contain a utilizable element. Although Levi is a Jew belonging to a species that it is opportune to suppress, he is judged to possess valuable knowledge. He is therefore sent to serve in the manufacture of synthetic rubber, an enterprise that Buna, also known as Auschwitz III, was avidly pursuing by means of slave labor and under the direction of I.G. Farben, which made a pretty penny out of it. The name Buna derives from the German production process for synthetic rubber. In other words, what Levi glimpses in Panwitz is an uneasy mixture of racist dehumanization with economic expediency. The mixture of racist dehumanization with economic expediency may not capture the essence of the great insanity. It doesn't correspond to the theory that Levi himself proposes elsewhere, that the camp's intention is to annihilate us, it's a quote, to annihilate us as men in order to kill us more slowly afterwards. But I find this analysis of Nazi villainy more plausible as an explanation of Auschwitz, if only an embryonic one. More plausible because it displays a recognizable multi-causal logic that invites the inspection of evidence that is familiar from American slavery and that is closer to the logic of slavery than to the programmatically impenetrable darkness of Lanzmann's Holocaust. The volatile compound of racism and utilitarianism takes its meaning from its place on a chart of history's recurring elements. Those of Levi's readers who have not renounced the habit of asking why will have perhaps wondered why he and his fellow inmates are treated so very cruelly, given that the Nazis have decided to keep them alive, at least for a time. Like the slapping away of the icicle, it seems like motiveless malignity. But there is a motive. That motive is the Nazis' need for an artificial substitute for rubber in a time of war, when supply lines for natural rubber and exotic raw material, which like so many others came from outside Europe, were unreliable. And there's also a why behind the paradoxical fact that the Nazis were self-consciously starving this useful workforce to death, the average lifespan in the camp for those not killed at once being about 3 months. Believing down to the end that they had access to unlimited supplies of fresh slave labor, the Nazi leaders felt that they could afford to behave like extreme capitalists, feeding and clothing and sheltering their workers minimally, offering them not subsistence, the Marxist model, but less than subsistence, in order to divert a maximum of resources both to the army and to German civilians at home. The German civilians at home also received, of course, the piles of possessions gathered up from the Jews who were gassed on arrival. The same policy included the clearing of land in Eastern Europe to be enjoyed eventually by German farmers, a policy that was happily, if euphemistically, compared to the seizure of lands in the American West from Native Americans. The story is told by the German historian Götz Ali in Hitler's Beneficiaries, that's his book, Hitler's Beneficiaries, Plunder, Racial War, and the Nazi Welfare State. In summary, it's a long quote. By exploiting material wealth, confiscated and plundered in a racial war, Hitler's National Socialism achieved an unprecedented level of economic equality and created vast new opportunities for upward mobility for the German people. That made the regime both popular and criminal. The cascade of riches and personal advantages, all derived from crimes against humanity, for which ordinary Germans were not directly responsible, but from which they gladly profited, led the majority of the populace to feel that the regime had their best interests at heart. Conversely, the Nazis' genocidal policy gained momentum from the fact that it also improved the material welfare of the German people. It does not seem audacious to propose with the historians that there are meanings in historical events, if not meanings untainted by controversy, and that this statement applies even to events as significance-threatening as the Holocaust. You may be asking, does this argument really need to be made? Isn't it pushing, aren't I pushing at an open door? If the pursuit of meaning in atrocities is not a waste of everyone's time, as I hope it isn't, I would argue it's because educated common sense, which might seem to take the meaningfulness of historical events for granted, is in fact often quietly swayed by the contrary position. One example is the everyday view that atrocities are an inevitable or at least a predictable result of human nature, which has had and always will have an irrepressible element of mindless and aggressive brutality. Sterling Michael Pavelek, who teaches at the U.S. Air Command and Staff College, writes in his book War and Warfare Since 1945, mankind is inherently violent, greedy, and selfish, and resorts to violence as a mechanism to prosper. This understanding of human nature makes war the rule rather than the exception. If so, atrocity is like original sin, and there can be no meaningful history of it, just an ever-unrolling spool of instances. But it is not just Christian conservatives and foreign policy hawks who are haunted by that ahistorical specter. The idea of racism as original sin, the phrase has been a point of contention in the 1619 Project, leads to much the same fatalistic view of eternally recurring atrocity. What Hegel called the slaughter bench view of history, quietly resigned to a future it assumes will mirror the past's turbulent stream of atrocities, has perhaps escaped critical scrutiny. I don't think people think they believe in that, because people are understandably suspicious of Hegel's alternative, and because the Slaughterbench view fits so comfortably into the more familiar and up-to-date sounding view of history as composed solely of differences. A conception more precisely that is instinctively skeptical about any proposed sameness or connectedness that, like lines of causality, would bridge those differences. Working together with, but at a deeper level than, the explicit commitments to identity with which it is often confused, the vision of history as difference expresses itself in the presumption that historical events are as justifiably and irremediably disconnected from each other as are the worldviews of distinct social collectivities. One, to me at least, unexpected place where this presumption pops up is Slaughterhouse-Five. It's arguably because Vonnegut forsakes everyday causal and comparative analysis that, though his intentions with regard to the bombing of Dresden are above reproach, the little he says about the bombing of Dresden has not held up well. He says the bombing of Dresden was worse than Hiroshima. He calls it the greatest massacre in European history. Neither statement is accurate. The figure he gives for the casualties, 130,000, is now seen as wildly inflated. Current estimates run from 25,000 to maybe 40,000. And this inflation is no surprise, for on this issue, Vonnegut cites David Irving, who later became notorious as a Holocaust denier and advocate for the Nazi cause. Vonnegut also cites 3 times the story that candles and soap were manufactured from the fat of the Nazis' victims, a story that now seems to be apocryphal. The more dramatically exceptional Vonnegut makes the bombing of Dresden, the more he insists that there is no why, the less relevant the ordinary tools of historical explanation come to seem, and the more prone Vonnegut is to fall into demonstrable error. In the self-described atrocitologist, Matthew White, the irrefutable premise that controversy about atrocity can never be definitively abolished segues into the more questionable corollary that it would be foolish to try to interpret atrocity at all. White scorns those who track atrocities, quote, back to some distant root cause and declare that to be the most horrible thing people ever did. This is not just true of root causes, it's true of historical causality as such. I quote, "So many threads of causality feed into any individual event that you can usually find a way to connect any 2 things you want. This is not as impassioned as declaring the project of understanding atrocity and obscenity, but it too rules historical analysis out of bounds. Instead of trying to understand atrocities, then, White resigns himself to merely listing them. He gives the world's 100 worst atrocities in chronological order, beginning with the wars between the Athenians and the Persians, and ending with the civil war in the Congo, 1998 to 2002. And at the end, he ranks the atrocities, beginning with the worst, according to the number of deaths. Alexander the Great comes in at only number 70, with 500,000 dead, 250,000 of them civilians. Both the numerical ranking and the chronological listing are funny, detached as they are, both from interpretive subjectivity and from the feelings of indignation, empathy, and shame that accounts of wanton slaughter might otherwise evoke. The humor is sort of winning, reflecting as it does White's cheery, hospitable premise that he will keep his appeals to readerly sentiment down to a minimum. The problem, maybe too obvious a problem, is politics. If monstrous, melodramatic villains give you a burning desire to do something, White's humor conveys the opposite message. It makes the very idea of doing something seem misguided, idiotic, even reprehensible. As a collection of disconnected events, the list is comical in part because it's random, shapeless, incongruous, meaningless. A list, White also calls his book a chronicle, is the opposite of what his namesake, Hayden White, would call a narrative. It has no through line, it doesn't add up to anything, you can't add anything to it that would make it add up to anything. In this way, it suggests that humanity's collective history, too, doesn't add up to anything, that the whole, even more than the parts, is random and meaningless. And the same holds for any political action that might be taken in an effort to redirect that history. Matthew White does not state explicitly that there's nothing to be done about atrocity, but that is the strong implication when he includes as the first of his 3 biggest lessons I learned while working on this list, the lesson that, quote, chaos is deadlier than tyranny. It follows that action taken against tyranny will be worse, measured in the currency of lives lost, than the tyranny itself. Action is counterproductive. Order, however unjust, is better than chaos. Justice is left better unpursued. The section on the 3 kingdoms of China, which ranks 25th with 34 million casualties, although it also extends over almost a full century, opens with a sentence I find paradigmatic. As the Han dynasty grew more corrupt, yeah, this is why I should have an image on the screen. You would stare at this sentence. As the Han dynasty grew more corrupt, peasant revolts unleashed chaos. As the Han dynasty grew more corrupt, peasant revolts unleashed chaos. Dynasties, kingdoms, and empires, however corrupt, represent order rather than chaos. Thus, they are preferable to peasant revolts, even if their corruption is the cause of those revolts. And since, this is what White assumes, the peasant results in no way diminish the quantity of injustice or suffering in the world, ever, since they have no cumulative effect on subsequent social organization or on the number of future fatalities. To repeat, history is a list of disconnected events. There is nothing redemptive in the disorder unleashed by the downtrodden. White attaches the same lesson to the fall of the Roman Empire. Those concerned with atrocity should not rejoice at the overthrow of this prototypical imperialist power, for, quote, the empire created real peace across a huge area for hundreds of years. So it's not just that controversy about atrocity can't be resolved, it should not be resolved, even roughly and provisionally. Any attempt to settle on a meaning would align the interpreter with one side or another, and would thus make it more likely that the interpretation would contribute down the line to unleashing chaos and creating more atrocities. Better than to acknowledge incomprehensible randomness. But it is also possible to read White's book against the grain. Here I make a maybe predictable turn in the argument, which I expect some possible pushback against. Looking for things that he himself hesitates to arrange in causal threads and patterns of meaning. One finds statements like this one from the section on Caesar's Gallic War, number 61 in the ranking of atrocities, with an estimated 700,000 victims. The first sentence of that section goes like this: the surest way to please the voters of Rome was to bring back plenty of loot from foreign conquests and distribute it liberally throughout the city. That sounds a lot like Hitler's beneficiaries. Immediately before that section, chronologically, is the Third Mithridatic War, the Roman campaign against the Black Sea kingdom of Pontus, with 400,000 dead. That war ended when Lucullus alienated his soldiers by, quote, being stingy with his loot. The First Punic War against Carthage is also said to have begun with local mercenaries raiding some of their neighbors for loot. Loot drops out of the picture strangely when White does Alexander the Great, but it reappears again and again in other vignettes. About Timur or Tamerlane the Great, he says, the most confusing thing about Timur's biography is that he simply attacked every which way, with no specific long-term plan other than conquest. Part of this was economic. Loot sustained armies in those days, so obviously he had to find a steady supply of rich enemies to rob. The authority of the leader depended on his ability to distribute loot to his followers. Loot, or what Ali calls plunder, was an independent and overriding principle of social organization, perhaps more revealing than coherent plans of conquest. Here, with great pain, I'm cutting a long section on the Vikings. I have had such fun finding out about the Vikings. Anyway, the moral of that is that modern scholars who are trying to break the stereotype of the Vikings, they do so basically by saying that raiding for plunder and conquest for tribute were not specific to the Vikings. They were kind of the rule in medieval Europe. And that's music to my ears. So there's an incipient theory of atrocity here. It looms fuzzily behind modern accounts of atrocity that do not otherwise go in much for theorizing, like White's. Consider Anthony Pagden's account of the destruction of Persepolis by the army of Alexander the Great in the winter of 331-330 BCE. Until now, Alexander had been relatively restrained in his handling of defeated populations, but his men were growing restless, eager to lay their hands on some of the booty they had been promised. Persepolis was turned over to the victorious army. The houses of the nobility were looted, the men slaughtered, and the women enslaved. It doesn't say what was done with the women before they were enslaved, or after. Pagden is noticeably gentle with Alexander. He says that Persepolis was turned over to Alexander's army. We don't watch Alexander turning it over. What Pagden tells us is that he had been relatively constrained in his handling of defeated populations, may be true, but was it ever within Alexander's power to constrain the slaughter of this defeated population? He had promised his men the booty, meaning the population's possessions, perhaps including the free use of the female inhabitants. Sooner or later, the booty would have to be turned over as well, and the inhabitants were going to pay. It was a system. And because it was a system, it often went unremarked. As Josephine Quinn notes, Julius Caesar says nothing in the Gallic War about the vast personal profits that he made in Gaul, enough to pay off his accumulated electoral debts, reward his officers and men, and fund a series of vanity building projects in the heart of Rome that kept the absent general at the center of attention during the 50s. No, his contemporaries did not see this degree of self-enrichment or the loyalty it brought him as standard practice. The poet Catullus, who was mentioned yesterday, writing in Rome, says that one of Caesar's corrupt officers has all the riches that used to belong to remotest Britain and hairy Gaul. But if it was remarked, it was not rebuked, let alone penalized. When it was proposed that Caesar be extradited to the Germans, as it was, after an especially bloody massacre, the objection was not to the massacre or to the stolen riches, but only to the breaking of a truce. The ordinary workings of the system shine brightly through when Caesar offers as extraordinary in his account of how a mass slaughter followed the Roman conquest of Avaricum, the absence of the usual force that motivated his men. I quote, "Not one of our men gave a thought to booty. They were so severely provoked by the massacre at Kennebum and the effort they had put into the siege that they spared neither the elderly, nor the women, nor even the little children. In the end, of a total number of about 40,000, barely 800 reached Vercingetorix safely." Not giving a thought to booty, which Caesar clearly expects his readers to find noteworthy, is just as clearly the exception to the rule. The rule implied is unambiguous. It's the promise of loot that keeps the soldiers willing to risk their lives, and the result is therefore always a wholesale slaughter of the civilian population, either as a necessary step toward the seizure of their possessions or as an enjoyable accompaniment to it and a respite from actual fighting with an armed enemy. By granting them an even, Caesar makes it clear that he does not take for granted the slaughter of little children. In mentioning the enemy's early misconduct and the energy his troops had made to conquer them, Caesar is addressing hypothetical scruples about the murder of civilians. He seems to have felt he had to. And yet, as the editor of Caesar's Gallic War puts it, the legionary expected profit to come from successful campaigns. Profit derived from plunder was the norm, as was, therefore, the killing of civilians. Here, with enormous pain, I'm cutting a quite long section on Josephus. If you have not read Josephus's account lately or ever of the destruction of Jerusalem, I recommend it. It's kind of incredible, but I'm already straining your patience. So at the end of that, I say, as a motive behind the slaughter of civilians and the destruction of the temple, the expectation of loot added as if as an afterthought clearly makes Josephus uncomfortable, almost as uncomfortable as it would be for him to have to lay the guilt on Titus, his patron. Yet the coupling of loot and the killing of non-combatants seems irrepressible. As the temple burned, anything found was looted, and anyone caught was killed. Looted, killed. The slaughter was massive, no pity shown for age, no regard for rank. Children, old men, laymen, priests were killed indiscriminately, and war extended its grip to encompass people of every class and condition, no matter they were begging for mercy or trying to resist. When it's all over, the troops with huge shouts of acclamation hailed Titus as imperator. And without a pause, Josephus then adds, as if suggesting the reason for the acclamation, all the soldiers had amassed so much loot that throughout Syria, the trading price of gold fell to half its former value. Would the commander have been so acclaimed if there had not been so much amassing of loot? The loot was the fulfillment of the promise that Titus, like any other Roman general, had implicitly or explicitly made to those who fought his campaigns. The slaughter of civilians was not an accident, but a logically necessary fulfillment of that contract. The acclamation Titus receives is his reward for carrying through on his promise. So the theory I've been sketching out thus far presents atrocity as a product of societies that were organized around plunder, and at least in many cases that depended on plunder, not just for their prosperity and identity, but also to cement relations between commanders and soldiers, political leaders, and their base. The killing of civilians was therefore systemic, not accidental, negligent, the work of human nature or a few bad apples. One problem here, which you may have noticed, is that where accounts of atrocity are concerned, I have tilted the scales against pre-modern fatalism and in favor of modernity, and nobody is very comfortable with that. All right, on to a conclusion. After his encounter with enormous forces in Dresden, that's a quote, Vonnegut's protagonist found his life meaningless. Vonnegut memorably crystallizes that conclusion in the slogan, "So it goes." The novel repeats "so it goes" over 100 times, mainly when deaths are mentioned, hinting each time that we should not be surprised or outraged by these deaths, natural or unnatural. It's a kind of secular ritual, and it might seem to suggest that the novel too is asserting the meaninglessness of life. I prefer to take "So it goes" as a sort of rhetorical provocation, a way of waking Americans out of their slumberous passivity, perhaps with special reference to the war in Vietnam, where civilian lives were again being destroyed from the air. It's hard to believe that in 1969 the author of Slaughterhouse-Five was enlisting his considerable writerly talents in an effort to dampen anti-war outrage. At any rate, the novel's allusions to Vietnam help explain what I have in mind when I no doubt naively stand up for the word meaningful. Those of us who might happily concede that life is of course meaningless, in the sense that nothing humans can do can rest its meaning on the foundation of imperatives issued from outside or above, may still feel that where atrocity is concerned, standing up against ongoing atrocities and diminishing the likelihood of future atrocities would indeed be meaningful actions. That atrocity deterrence is a project that could not be rejected out of hand as random, absurd, meaningless. Note that the deterrence of atrocity, which is oriented to the future rather than the past, not only diverges from blaming, but also, as human rights specialists have observed, sometimes threatens to undermine the enterprise of bringing past malefactors to justice, and indeed threatens to create further suffering and further atrocity, as in the case of humanitarian militarism. I'm cutting a bit. In one of its allusions to ongoing American atrocities in Vietnam, Slaughterhouse-Five tells a story, supposedly the plot of a work of fiction by somebody else, about a robot with bad breath. A robot with bad breath who was involved in the dropping of napalm. The robot looked like a human being and could talk and dance and so on, and go out with girls. and nobody held it against him that he dropped jellied gasoline on people. But they found his halitosis unforgivable. But then he cleared that up, and he was welcome to the human race. Some kind of a parable, I'm not sure what kind of a parable. In general, we tend to applaud the inclusion of those whom the human race has heretofore excluded. No such applause is invited here. So what's the point? A dark reading would fit the parable within a so it goes fatalism. Human nature is such that the all-too-human race will be quick to blame the one who suffers from bad oral hygiene, but will be much less likely to blame the one who, following their society's own orders, drops jellied gasoline on the inhabitants of some other society. Societies do not tend to blame themselves for violence against other societies. But Vonnegut knows it's possible to blame one's own society. That's what he's doing about Dresden. And his moral could be rephrased in less fatalistic terms. His society needs to learn how to shun those who drop napalm in the way it shuns those who suffer from halitosis. Like the novel, society is better at dealing with halitosis, or aspects of personal conduct for which an individual can be properly held responsible and that can potentially be cleared up, than it is at dealing with the dropping of napalm, a rather more serious infraction. Bad rather than merely disgusting or ridiculous, for which society itself must be held responsible. If the goal for society to clear up its dropping of napalm, the goal is for society to clear up its dropping of napalm, the way the robot clears up his halitosis, it would not be helpful for shunning to be outlawed. The practice of social exclusion, while it seems harsh, might well prove necessary. Not burning people alive is a very, very desirable moral good, much higher on the scale than including everyone, no matter who or what they are doing. The moral imperative would be not to give up on villains, but to get better at identifying the real ones, individual or collective. So here I'm cutting a section on Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, Theirs Not to Reason Why, and a section on John Hersey's Hiroshima. Because he encounters survivors who say, shikata ga nai, a Japanese expression as common as and corresponding to the Russian nichvo, it can't be helped, oh well, too bad. Not a reaction that can be simply dismissed. Still, my preference, obviously, goes to the updating of the concept of a villain that I find in Kenzaburo Oe's Hiroshima Notes. When he first visits Hiroshima in the 1960s, Oe is impressed with those victims of the atomic bomb who have mobilized against nuclear weapons. Though that mobilization took time, it was a big step away from fatalism. 30 years later, however, in 1995, and with help from earlier readers, his reasoning has taken him further. At the time of writing the essays in this book, I was sadly lacking in the attitude and ability needed to recast Hiroshima in an Asian perspective. In that respect, I reflected the prevailing Japanese outlook on Hiroshima. In response to criticisms from Korea and the Philippines, however, I have since revised my views of Hiroshima. I have focused more on Japan's wars of aggression against Asian peoples, on understanding the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as one result of those wars. This means that while criticizing the United States for dropping their bombs, the A-bomb victims also, quote, hold the Japanese state responsible for their sufferings. So, not wrong to blame the United States, but it would be wrong not also to blame Japanese militarism, especially militarism at the expense of his fellow Asians, or maybe militarism as something shared by the US and Japan. Aerial bombardment, as in Dresden, makes it seem as if everything has changed and nothing has changed. Alexander Kluge suggests in his comico-philosophical way that bombing changes the principle of war itself because it takes loot out of the equation. The modern cavalry, Kluge writes, this is a little hard to follow, revived what had motivated early tree climbers, animals, in the history of the species, to find the nourishing amnion eggs of large dinosaurs, to bite the shell open from the side or from below, and either to place their own brood inside or suck them dry. It's quite clear that this root of strategic interest, booty, does not apply in the case of bomber crews, since they put something into the town that is their target, will never take anything away from it, in order, even in the most abstract sense, to suck something out. This is an overstatement. It presents bombing as unnatural, but it does so by naturalizing the quest for booty. The two are not so perfectly opposed. In the most abstract sense, modern industrialized aggressors do arguably suck something out of their victims. I'm skipping again because I can't bear what I'm doing to you by going on so long. The climax of Slaughterhouse-Five is not the bombing of Dresden. Though that bombing, announced at the beginning of the novel, has been long delayed, Vonnegut spends very few words on it. There is almost nothing about the bombing itself except as noises off. There is little description of the uninhabitable ruins, except for the protagonist's assignment to dig bodies out of what Vonnegut calls corpse mines. The novel's real climax, one page from the end, is an execution, which has also been anticipated but is also left undescribed. Somewhere in there, the poor old high school teacher Edgar Derby was caught with a teapot he had taken from the catacombs. He was arrested for plundering. He was tried and shot. Derby's death seems more distressing than the novel's other losses, though it too gets its resigned, unsurprised, so it goes. It's distressing because Kirby is presented as the novel's only real character, as if he alone has somehow stood up against the enormous forces that have turned those around him into listless playthings. And his death is especially distressing because the motive for the killing is absurd, the taking of a teapot that no one is left to feel the lack of, the taking of a trivial household object in the midst of the world historical wreckage left by a much, much greater crime. But there is another almost imperceptible irony here. The act for which Derby is arrested and executed is plundering. For most of human history, as we have seen, plunder was almost inseparable from atrocity. It was the promise of plunder that guaranteed that war between armies would spill over into the substantial deaths of non-combatants. In the sequence with which Vonnegut chooses to end his novel, we see that the promise of plunder has been withdrawn. The rule against looting is absurd as it is applied to the theft of a teapot, but its application nonetheless shows that a norm has come into existence, an anti-looting norm. The emergence of such norms, which seem so callous in their misplaced universality, is an event on which I think the literary history of atrocity turns. It's an aspect of modernity. It also straddles the much disputed line separating the pre-modern from the modern. Scruples concerning the killing of non-combatants and civilizational others clearly exist before modernity. But the scruples accumulate and increase in intensity. Scruples are finally embodied in the new genre of literary cosmopolitanism that we see in Vonnegut and that deserves more attention than it has received, national self-accusation of atrocity. Self-accusation is rare. It is no doubt easier than self-boycott. How do you boycott the country where you reside and where you're obliged to satisfy your daily needs? But even the lesser gesture of accusing your homeland is awkward, and the awkwardness helps explain Vonnegut's uncertainty about villains. It's hard to know whether the absence of villains from Slaughterhouse-Five should be seen as an affirmation of higher literary and moral principles, or as a representational failure, the failure to clinch the condemnation of one's own. Or if not a failure, then one moment in a process that's far from finished. Thank you for your patience. I'm sorry I really went on longer than I was supposed to.
But there is a few minutes for questions before we turn Leia's electric presence on. Bruce?
Yeah, please comment on your terrific analysis of Vonnegut and the history that you presented as a context for what's going on in Ukraine. And I'm sure many of us were thinking about that as you focused on atrocity.
I think you should say something. I'm completely talked out. I have no more thought on any subject. No, seriously.
Yeah, but you're the expert on atrocity based on what you have presented. I haven't had a chance to think about this. I mean, I keep thinking, well, Putin is just mentally ill, but I know there's more to it than that.
I just read an analysis that Putin likes to look mentally ill, but really this is about loot, about the oil reserves, the shale gas, etc., in this particular part of Ukraine, which is now he's hoping to take. And that actually the end game is just like what you were talking about. The atrocities are there in order to, in the end, deliver the loot to Russia. That at least fits in with one of your theories.
I'll just say I'm suspicious of the impulse toward material reductiveness that this argument really clearly embodies. And I don't want to take anything away from the craziness of Putin, or, it would be unfair to him.
It was a wonderful talk in every way. I want to go back to Slaughterhouse-Five and the stipulation that there are no villains. As I recall,
it's his father telling him that.
As I recall in that novel, it is subtitled "The Children's Crusade." Vonnegut, or the narrator, is constructing a scenario, a mise en scène, in which villains are necessary pretexts for the justification of any form of war. So the Children's Crusade is the subtitle because he wants to suspend any scenario that would motivate children to want to be involved in a war. But it isn't because he doesn't see the excess presence of villains. The key moment in that remarkable narrative is the moment in which Billy Pilgrim imagines the firebombing of Dresden taking place in reverse, in which the bombs are returned to this place in which they're manufactured, and then all the resources that went into the creation of the bombs, which would be the primitive accumulation that you're associating with looting, are put back into the ground. That narrative is not a narrative that is affirming of the statement there are no villains. It's rejecting that statement, but attempting to produce, as you do in your wonderful presentation, an alternative way to be alive as human in the world. Cat's Cradle is a narrative, as you know, by Vonnegut, in which he's doing precisely what you've presented. He's producing a justification for opposing atrocity. But the only reason I'm asking this question this way is because that narrative seems to have other implications and framing it within the specific, what I consider wonderful, justification for resentment against villains. You've done. It's just an effort to suggest a narrative is not quite doing what you're suggesting.
I have to say, I've been fascinated by the film that he runs in reverse ever since I first read it, and it's picked up by other people also. And really just felt, I don't know quite what to do with this. It reminds me of certain commodity chains of commodity narratives where you trace something back to its origin. It also ends with Adam and Eve. Which is very,
it's with Adam and Eve, but the moments, and the Tralfamadorians are also producing a kind of wisdom instruction by suggesting that you can re-enter any moment in time. There's also an account of historicity that's in that narrative that would work, that works slightly against your utilization of it as a kind of meta-parable for your wonderful talk. So it's just an effort to suggest that narrative is...
I think that's right. Thank you.